I feel like almost anyone who tells you that alert fatigue and alert noise is not a problem is either lying to you or lying to themselves. The most fundamental value from an SRE is curiosity. Probably the most important things that I'm looking for from new SREs. That is the one thing you cannot teach, right? You can teach technology, you can teach programming, you can teach pretty much anything. But SREs are almost required to have that innate curiosity. Your data and your metrics are really only as good as your interpretations. If you don't think carefully around what are you doing with that data, what are you using that as a proxy for, right? These are all proxy metrics. If you're using number of incidents as a proxy for the reliability of your systems, that's a problem.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Incidentally Reliable podcast, where we chat with veterans in reliability, talk about some dodge bullet, battle-tested engineering innovation, their war room stories and their opinion on the current state of space. Today we have Abhishek with us, who is currently Director SRE at Cribl. Prior to this, he has worked with companies like Pinterest, Google and Microsoft. Hi Abhishek, thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Ankur. I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah. I think we have a discussion before. I saw you talking about your experience in multiple companies, Microsoft, Google, and then joining Pinterest. How was the experience with Microsoft, Google, and what was your role in Microsoft, Google? If you can talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So Microsoft is a company I joined immediately after grad school. I went to graduate school in Carnegie Mellon here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And then I joined Microsoft as a program manager. For most other companies, that role is what you would call a product manager in most other companies. I was in two different orgs at Microsoft, first with the online systems division, which specifically with Live Search. We used to call it Live Search at that time. It became Bing during the time I was there. And then later with Microsoft Office. In both of those cases, but especially in Bing, that was really my first introduction to internet scale distributed systems, running systems at scale in a way that is reliable, secure, and also performant.
So,
Sorry.
So in the reality, you actually started with reliability from get-go itself, right?
It was an aspect of my role.
Okay.
I would say that my main focus was on Bing's front-end platform.
Okay.
So a lot of it was about delivering that experience to users. But yes, reliability, performance, and things that are of interest to SRE was always part of it, even if that was not my specific role at that time. It was certainly a big aspect of my role. At Google, I was with the Google Cloud Platform, and specifically the product I was working on was Google's Observability product.
Oh, nice.
So this was the monitoring, logging, alerting, anomaly detection product suite. And at that time, we were also integrating an acquisition. This is Stackdriver. If you've heard of Stackdriver, back then. So that was the org. And the product itself, at least the seeds of that product, was written by SREs within Google. Eventually, obviously, there was a full software development organization around it. And most interestingly, pretty much all our customers were SREs or equivalent orgs. At that time, not all orgs had the whole SRE concept, but they had something similar. And so for us, for me, that was a really good introduction to the world of SRE, because I got to see some very mature organizations, as well as some orgs that were very early in the stage and just kind of starting to move from that operations mindset into an SRE reliability engineering kind of mindset.
So, did you have any learning from your Bing experience in reliability, which you took it to Google? Google being the pioneer of SRE, right? They were the ones who actually came up with the term SRE. So, do you think that experience, did you take anything from Microsoft, or Do you think the culture was completely different in Google?
The companies were definitely very different culturally, and they remain very different culturally. These are both very large companies, so a lot of one of the issues that happens in these companies is that the culture depends very specifically on the product area that you're in. So I would say that there were some learnings and some things that obviously I was able to take in. That's part of your experience, right? But it wasn't an equivalent role, right? There were enough differences in the role that I had to learn a lot. I learned a lot at Microsoft. I definitely learned a lot at Google. I think both of those roles definitely helped me prepare for my role at Pinterest, which is where I was for 7.5 years until basically earlier this year. And specifically in my head of SRE role at Pinterest, I don't think I would have been at all successful in that role, even to the extent that I was. I wouldn't be at all successful in that role without the rigorous background that Google and Microsoft and various other experiences I provided.
I think you talked about Pinterest, right? Pinterest has always been a very unique social media platform. I think no other product came closer in creating a community so transparent and safe as Pinterest. Were there any conventional metrics beyond standard uptime or latency that your team used to track to measure the health and user experience of Pinterest platform?
Yeah, so Pinterest still has an entire trust and safety team that specifically looks at things like harmful content, right? And they have extremely mature definitions around the type of content that we don't specifically want to promote on Pinterest. So yes, Pinterest is definitely an industry leader in that area. So there was a lot, and the SRE team worked very closely with that team whenever there were any issues specifically with content. When it came to the overall user experience, I would actually say that one of our most critical metrics at Pinterest, in fact, an evolution of our availability metric, was very interesting because it took into account the user experience and the user journey. So let me explain what that means. So normally, when you have a large internet scale system like Pinterest, you could measure uptime or availability through a metric like, for example, raw success rate, right? The number of successful responses over the total number of responses you're sending out. And that's fine. And we did have that metric too, and that was fine. But it suffers from a lot of deficiencies. For example, it doesn't really tell you what the customer is experiencing. It treats all requests and all responses pretty much the same way. So, for example, if a customer or if a user comes to your platform, experiences a pretty catastrophic error and just shuts off the app and doesn't come back for 5 days, that's one error, right? But it's also possible that a user is just scrolling through your app and maybe all that was missed was, the failure to render one image somewhere, and they didn't even see it. Well, that's an error too, but it may not be as impactful as the other error that we talked about, right? So at Pinterest, we came up with this metric that we called user uptime, or pinner uptime, because we call our users pinners. It was designed by one of our most experienced SREs, Joe Gordon, who is now at OpenAI, I believe. And what the metric does is it builds on the work that exists in the broader industry. Google specifically had this paper around meaningful availability that we looked at quite a lot. And it was a big inspiration for us, even though that's not exactly what we built. But basically, at a conceptual level, it looks at for each user, the proportion of time that they can do what they want to do on Pinterest. And so if an error happens and immediately after that they continue to work and they're getting a fully available experience, then that error counts for a very small amount of time. However, if an error occurs and the user doesn't get a positive experience until let's say 3 hours later or 3 days later, we count that entire period as downtime for that user. So this allowed us to account for things like, correct for things like users who are extremely active on the platform versus those who are not. and also account for their actual experience. There was a lot more than what I'm getting into here, but that was the high level gist of it. And I think that really it shows the kind of user experience driven culture that we had at Pinterest.
Do you think like the thing you mentioned just now, that your team would consider from the time the user has faced an issue until the time that experience has been improved as a downtime for that particular user? Do you think that is part of the
Exactly.
KPI, or are there any other thing uh, are defined as a KPI for your SRE team?
So at Pinterest, we had this concept, or rather, we came up with this concept called North Star metrics. Because one of the things about SRE is that one good thing about SRE is that there's a lot of data and a lot of metrics. So it is extremely easy to be data driven because there is just so much of it. However, that is also, it's both a blessing and a curse, because when you have so many different metrics, it is kind of difficult for you to know what exactly you're optimizing for. So we spent a lot of time coming up with a small set of metrics that we believed were the best overall representation of what we're trying to achieve in terms of reliability and user safety. It was a small set of metrics that we considered North Star. It was our North Star. These metrics were reported at various different forums, all the way from individual ICs going all the way up to our company leadership, and including beyond that into the board audit committee. So these were metrics that looked at things like, well, the user uptime metric that I mentioned, it was absolutely one of them. But there were a few others. One example was the actual business impact of incidents. So, for example, revenue, right? How much revenue is impacted by incidents? Another example was commit safety. So, for example, how many incidents do you have per, let's say, 1,000 commits? Another way to look at that was, if you were committing something into production, what were the chances that it would lead to an incident? So that helped us look at the safety of our commit pipelines and not the work that our engineers were doing. So those are the types of things that we were looking at. Another example was severity of incidents, right? Given an incident, how would we know, or how would we ensure that the severity of that incident is minimized, either through minimizing the blast radius or by reducing the amount of time it takes to mitigate the impact to the user? One very important metric that we did not have as a North Star, or indeed a metric that we didn't care about much, was just the raw number of incidents. One of the issues that you have when it comes to these metrics is, you want to think about the incentives that you're driving, right? Like, what is the metric? What are you actually measuring? And what behaviors do you want out of it? So if we rely on our engineers to declare incidents, right? Any engineer, regardless of their level or regardless of where they sit in the company, could declare an incident, and they could bring any resources they needed to bear to that incident. But if you create a metric which incentivizes fewer incidents, what are the incentives you're creating? What behaviors would you expect when that happens, right? So we were very clear that that was not a metric that we at least thought about as a North Star to achieve.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, do you think how do you define cost of a downtime in Pinterest? Is it just the user iteration, or is it in real revenue dollar you would measure?
So there are. I'll talk about this in a more general way, because this gets into some areas that I probably don't want to get into too much in detail. But if you look at, so obviously revenue is a very key metric that Pinterest has, right? So the revenue impact of metrics is something that we track very closely. But Pinterest and companies like Pinterest track many other metrics, right? As you're aware, engagement, you mentioned it, user engagement, that's something, and we have metrics around those. And you want to make sure that you're tracking things like user impact, user engagement impact, user growth impact, things like that. Specifically when it comes to revenue, because that's probably easiest to talk about, if you look at Pinterest's financial filings, public filings, you will know that Pinterest made about a little more than $3 billion last year, right? Now, that works out to, if you divide that by the number of seconds in a year, that works out to roughly $100 a second, right? So if you have an incident that goes on for, let's say, 15 to 20 minutes, that's $100,000 in revenue right there, right?
Yeah.
If your incident lasts for 3 hours, that's $1 million.
Yeah.
Assuming, of course, that the incident means you're making more revenue.
Mm-hmm.
In reality, it's much more nuanced than that because Pinterest has, or like most companies, there is seasonality in our traffic. There is a daily and weekly and monthly cycle to our traffic. So we had tools that were written by our monetization team in collaboration with our data analytics team and with SRE that basically helps an SRE understand the ongoing revenue impact and the post-factor revenue impact once an incident has been closed. Though that was a very important metric that we used to track a lot. However, it is also important to realize that not all incidents have the same kind of impact, and you need to be careful about understanding that, right? It was, knock on wood, very rare for us to have a world where Pinterest as a whole would be down. Instead, one of many microservices that participate in serving the Pinterest experience, that could be affected or down or somehow degraded. And so that is where it's really important for SRE to have a clear understanding of which systems are critical, which interactions between systems are critical, where do you have the most risk, right? What are the constraints in your entire landscape? And to me, that is one of the key things that an SRE can deliver that just an engineering team cannot, because an engineering team thinks of their world in terms of a specific system or a group of systems. But SREs are uniquely positioned to think of the interaction between systems, right? And we can build things that can mitigate or alleviate impact, even in otherwise critical request paths, for example. So to me, that is one of the most important things that SREs bring to the table.
Okay. You talked about a lot of tooling by yourself within Pinterest, right? How do you think that culture was brought on? And from the other user's perspective, how costly is it to actually have your own tooling than relying on external tooling? Have you done any analysis since you were the head of SRE, or what was the requirement of having your own tooling?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question and something that we grappled with throughout my time at Pinterest. So in any company, this always comes up, right? Build versus buy. And I would say that there are some very standard things you don't need to build, reinvent the wheel for everything. So there are standard things that most companies use that we would use as well. A good example is, for example, PagerDuty. It is rare for most companies to be able to build a notification platform that can compete with that. Same with something like Jira. Companies like Microsoft and Google, sure, they build their own platforms from scratch. But for most other companies, it may not make sense to build something like that from scratch. Pinterest did have a culture where we relied more on building than buying. Part of it was purely the culture that we had created at Pinterest. And part of it was actually intentional, right? For example, Pinterest operates at a very high scale. You can probably do the math, but it's on the order of a very large number of requests per second, right? At that scale, the cost that you incur if you're buying an off-the-shelf observability suite, it's going to be significant. It's going to be massive. And at that point, if you compare that with the ability to have, let's say, a 5-person or an 8-person or a 10-person engineering team, that may not be a bad trade-off, right? And so for Pinterest especially, that trade-off did make sense for us in terms of building it internally. We needed a platform that understands our traffic patterns, that is performant enough to meet our use cases. And also, Pinterest had the engineering brand to be able to attract the kind of engineering team that you need to be able to build a platform like that, right? It is, I wouldn't say it's within the capability of a lot of companies out there. So when the stars align, surely it makes sense. Personally, certainly in the company I'm in now, and in general, if I were to do this all over again, I would probably buy a lot more. Simply because at the end of the day, you're competing with industry standard solutions that are being built by teams of hundreds, if not thousands of engineers. It's their job to think about this day in, day out. And it's probably a lot easier to attract talent that already understands those platforms, right? So I would do that. But in some cases, the numbers just don't make sense. A bit
So since you talked about tooling a lot, right? So does that mean your Pinterest as a whole, as a company, were involved in contributing to open source community as well, or were you also releasing some open source projects?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Pinterest has quite a few pretty large scale open source contributions. Probably the best example I can think of is our deployment platform, which we call Teletran. That is, I believe it is used by quite a few other companies as well. This is actually quite common across the industry, especially by larger companies. The ability to give back to the community is something that I'm fully in favor of. Especially when you're building something in-house, it always makes sense to open source it and give it back. I have found that there is a healthy amount of cooperation within the industry and with our partners or with other companies in tech. We definitely had a lot of that positive relationship. So yes, the short answer to your question is yes. The longer answer, though, is that sometimes, of course, there is this trade-off between what is financially and from a business standpoint, viable to open source. And I think nowadays, especially with things like AI, where there is proprietary data involved, you're starting to see a lot more proprietary things just not being shared within the industry. To me, it's a bit of a shame. I would say that SRE as a whole wouldn't have existed if Google hadn't decided to kind of open source their knowledge, right? Like the Google SRE book was a good example of this, right? So for me, I am definitely very much in favor of this. The war stories that we learn, that we discuss from, and we learn from each other, it's very useful because it's a small number of companies that operate around the world at that scale. And that scale brings its own unique challenges, right? Things that would be merely, edge cases in a smaller environment suddenly become just your day-to-day standard, right? Or things that would normally be optimizations, like caching, for example, suddenly become critical parts of your infrastructure, if not foundational to your infrastructure, right? So for a lot of companies at that scale, things like Memcache are absolutely critical to the way they operate and the way they deliver their product. So yeah, definitely, yeah.
Cribl has built a horizontal suite of products ranging from log processing solutions to search and even data lakes. Being an observability vendor yourself, there must be some distinct observability challenges you encounter, nevertheless, considering the wide range of tightly coupled products you offer, right?
Yeah, so for the benefit of your listeners, I'll maybe just spend a minute on what I'm doing now. So yeah, currently I'm head of SRE and cloud infrastructure at Cribl. So like you mentioned, yes, Cribl is a big data company. We are the data engine for IT and security. We are a multi-product company. So Cribl is it's a very interesting product because it empowers organizations to transform their data strategy. Our customers see us as a very vendor agnostic solution, and we give them the ability to collect, process, analyze, route data, any data, but specifically IT and security data from any source to any destination. So we have four main products. One, the heart of our product suite is Cribl Stream, which does exactly that. Take data from almost any arbitrary destination, do some pretty powerful amounts of processing to that data, filtering, decorating, and so forth, and then put it into pretty much any arbitrary data source. That's the heart of our product. We also have an intelligent vendor-neutral agent solution on the server side, which we call Cribl Edge. We have Cribl Lake, which is a turnkey, highly cost-effective data lake. And finally, we have Cribl Search all around this, which is a search-in-place solution and analytics solution. So we have built this entire suite. What's great about this suite is it works very well together, but each of those pieces work really well by themselves as well. And the reason we have targeted this to observability, IT, and security specifically is that this data is pretty unique. Firstly, there is a huge amount of IT and security data. Observability data is pretty massive. It comes from all sorts of different sources. There are not many, or shall I say, there are maybe too many standards around the way this data is shaped and sized. So what that means is there is no real standard. This data can come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. And some of our customers tell us that their leadership thinks of this data as very low value because you don't know what to do with it until something happens, and then it becomes the most valuable data, right? Because if an incident happens, it suddenly becomes the most critical data. So very often, especially if you're in an industry like manufacturing, you may not have the full technical capabilities to know what to do with that data. And so that is the thing that Cribl solves for them. So to me, it has been a very interesting move from Pinterest into Cribl, because some things don't change, right? The basic concepts around how do you take a large distributed system and make it reliable and robust, and how do you preempt and understand risk, that doesn't change. But a lot of the specifics have changed for us. So I believe you asked us about the distinct challenges that we encounter. So yes, the products are tightly coupled. It's also one of the selling points for Cribl is that we have very strict customer workload isolation. So there is a large part of the entirety of our data plane is not multi-tenant. So customers have the peace of mind that even by mistake, something very crazy would have had to happen for us to, have any commingling or norm isolation, right? So that's a very important thing that we deliver to customers. So it is important for us to understand that there's a lot of really, really highly critical data that our customers are running through our pipelines. And so it behooves us to be extremely careful and extremely intentional about how we are building stuff. We do not have the luxury to move fast and break things, right? Like if you're a social media platform, sure, maybe a couple of posts got lost, not a huge deal. With us, that's not the case. So we cannot afford to think of our work that way. So there are a lot more controls. There are a lot more challenges. We hold ourselves to that standard. Having said that, there are aspects, like I said earlier, there are aspects of our platform that are less maybe immediately customer critical, and we are able to move a lot faster, provide a lot more, do a lot more experimentation and so forth on that as well. Yeah.
Like you mentioned on a smaller note, right? In a social media platform, even a post loss is not a big deal. Although I know for a fact that even in
I wouldn't say it's a big deal. I would say that maybe if
it's not a life-threatening.
If you fail to show a pretty good post to one specific user because of, let's say,
but in case of Cribl right now, you are in a space where if you lose a small chunk of data, also it's irrecoverable, right? Because first of all, identifying that problem. So how do you think the SRE practices around that problem have changed personally for you? Because you come from a background where you have spent 7 years in a different industry. And how did it evolve for you in this industry?
So one important thing that I've learned is that it is very important to tie the work that we do as SREs to the company's business and to its customers, right? To the customer value delivery. It's very easy to get into this world where you're only looking at, let's say, technical infrastructure. You're so lost in the weeds that you're not really thinking about that customer value. So one of the first things that I did at Cribl was try and articulate very clearly what is it that we do for our customers. Some of it is very obvious, right? Reliability is something that is very important to our customers. They don't want their data to be lost, for example. They want the system to be up and running when they need it. So yes, that's one aspect. Another aspect, I touched on is governance, for example. right? Security, privacy, especially around the data. But there are other pieces as well, right? For example, we are an SRE organization. We rely on our own product to basically observe ourselves, right? To a large extent, right? Um, we our own Cribl search, for example, is our primary search tool, right? One of our research tools. And so for us, that is extremely important that we are maybe the first and best users of our own product, and we are able to provide that feedback into our product teams to in many ways reflect the pain that our customers feel and the problems that our customers face, and to be able to be kind of cognizant of that and have that empathy with our customers. So that's one aspect that has definitely been very unique for me at Cribl. Another aspect is that you are when you're a high growth company, you're constantly balancing the need to be mature, thoughtful, and intentional versus the need to grow. And one great thing about Cribl is that our leaders are extremely technical. So for them, reliability is not an afterthought. It is very baked into their thinking. But at the same time, within the rank and file, within the teams, we always have to make that trade-off, right? And I would be lying if I told you that any team I worked at ever in my career has got that right? You're always falling in that trap of having to trade off between the two. And now you could argue that things like SLOs, error budgets give you the ability to not have to trade off between them. And if you have the right kind of development processes in place, if you have the right kind of engineering culture in place, it's not a trade-off. It is one and the same thing. So to me, that has been extremely important coming into Cribl and being, kind of maybe curbing some of my own instincts around velocity versus reliability.
I think you said that you are your own first customer. You have that first customer experience. I think we at Zenduty have the similar experience also. Just on the product side, do you think when you're getting feedback from your customer, do you as a team evolve by hearing your customer experience, or for you it's not a new experience? Or do you still learn about the new things which your customers are doing or the way they are using your tool?
We absolutely learn all the time, right? Oh. I mean, I would say that the thing about complex distributed systems is that there is no real book for this stuff. I mean, I know that there are any number of DevOps and S3 books out there, but they don't tell you specifics about how your system will evolve over time. They don't give you any insight into what exactly is going to be the bottleneck, the hotspots in the system, right? Those are things that you have to figure out for yourself. So for me, one of my favorite things about S3, and also one of the hardest things about S3, is that everything you do is a learning opportunity, right? Every incident is a learning opportunity. So for me, every customer call is also a learning opportunity. I would say that that's maybe one of the things that I need to do a little bit more. We do some of that, but we need to continue doing a lot more of that. You have to learn from your own experience, your own customers, or from your own systems. So to me, that is extremely important. One of the foundational values we have at Cribl within our engineering team, which is very aligned with what I think of as the most fundamental value from an SRE, is curiosity. It is probably the most important things that I'm looking for from new SREs. That is the one thing you cannot teach, right? You can teach technology, you can teach programming, you can teach pretty much anything, but SREs are almost required to have that innate curiosity. You need to be able to see something in a log file output. You need to be able to see some piece of behavior, see something in a dashboard and say, even if that's not a problem, I want to know what happened there. That seems strange to me. And 9 times out of 10, sure, you will probably just learn something extremely tactical. It's not going to be a problem. But sometimes you will find that, okay, there is a risk that you didn't know about, or there is a hotspot that you didn't know about. There is a behavioral quirk that you didn't know about. This is what happens in complex systems. And you, beyond a certain scale and certain level of complexity, it is non-negotiable to be able to do that. And so we set up a lot of our processes around that. around being able to learn from, whether it's incidents or issues or customers experience.
Okay. How do you, since you work in observability space, your sole bread and butter is around data, right? How do you find the right balance between quantitative and qualitative data? To give you an example, has there been any situation where relying solely on metrics might lead your SRE team to astray?
Yeah, absolutely. So your your data and your metrics are really only as good as your interpretations of them, right? So what are they telling you and what are you learning from them, right? So a little earlier I gave the example of the metric of the number of incidents, right? Raw number. That's an example of a piece of data that is pretty easy to get. So you should have really high quality data around the number of incidents. You can do all sorts of trend line analysis and everything around it, right? But if you don't think carefully around what are you doing with that data, what are you using that as a proxy for, right? These are all proxy metrics. If you're using the number of incidents as a proxy for the reliability of your systems, that's a problem because there are way better metrics around it that tell you the actual reliability level of your systems, right? Similarly, what are you doing with that data? What happens when the data goes in a direction that you don't want it to, right? What changes do you institute? And for when it comes to the number of incidents, that is actually something that we used to look at Pinterest, right? We used to look at that data in many other companies. I've seen many companies in the industry that look at that data. Even at Cribl, it's part of the conversation, right? So what do you do with that, right? What happens when your number of incidents are growing at a certain level? Is it completely useless? No, it's not, because it tells you something, right? It tells you that um, okay, a substantial portion of your time is being spent dealing with incidents, right? And that comes with its own attendant problems, right? But it should spark more analysis, right? What did you expect to see? Do your incidents scale with traffic? Do they scale with business growth? Or do they scale with something else? Do they scale with the complexity of your systems, right? So these are things that you need to understand and you need to dig in more. So to me, data is a tool just like anything else. It does not replace judgment, and more specifically, it's really what really matters is what questions you're asking around the data. That is one of the reasons why, for example, I talked about the North Star metrics we had at Pinterest earlier. We created a metric around the number of incidents we have. The number of high severity incidents we have divided by the total number of incidents. But then we had another metric around the number of incidents we have divided by the number of commits and engineering changes. So in one case, the total number of incidents was in the numerator, and in another case, the total number of incidents was in the denominator. So it kind of keeps you honest, right? You don't build the incentive to either reduce or increase it because it'll affect your metrics in a certain way. That's just one example, but to me, it is imperative that you design the metrics right. It is imperative that you build the muscle to ask the right kind of questions. And finally, it is imperative that you design the processes around the metrics properly. If you have a metric that doesn't change your behavior, it's not a useful metric. But if you have a metric that changes your behavior in the way that you don't want, right? You are hurting yourself. You're kicking yourself in the foot. I don't know who said it. I believe it was Charlie Munger, who is Warren Buffett's partner for a long time. I believe he said something to the effect of, tell me the incentives and I'll tell you what the outcome is going to be. I fully agree with that. Right? In SRE, that is an extremely important thing because the metrics that we gather and we report on, they don't just affect what SRE does. They affect, in a DevOps environment, they affect what all of engineering does, and in some cases, what the broader product engineering organization does, right? So you have to treat those metrics and design those metrics with a lot of care and intention.
Okay. How far do you think automation can go in managing observability pipelines? So what are some irreplaceable human elements that will always be crucial to SRE focused in observability space?
Yeah, I was smiling when you said that because Nowadays, especially, it's interesting. I mean, let me back up a little
Mhm.
bit. I'll get back to what I was saying. When it comes to when it comes to automation, that is bread and butter for SREs, right? We often talk about how we don't want manual toil. We need to get rid of it to the extent possible. There is absolutely no issues with that. That is not something that I want to change. It's a culture. If I, in fact, I believe it's a culture that even now is insufficient within SRE. Most SREs I've seen, and so for me, that culture of continuing to automate toil away is absolutely a positive development, right? However, now we are in a world where AI is all the rage, machine learning is all the rage, and so we are in a world where SRE teams and DevOps teams are asking themselves that question, right? To what extent can we rely on AI to give us insights and detect anomalies and so forth? And I would say that there is absolutely room for it, right? Like when it comes to, for example, anomaly detection, AI has been used in anomaly detection for a while now. It's a very good application of AI and ML. So yeah, great, right? We should continue to lean into that, and we should do that. However, when it comes to actually, it is extremely tempting to build a whole sort of AI driven AI ops culture, right? Where your machine learning algorithms and your machine learning functions tell you where the hotspots are. They tell you where the problems lie, and maybe even in some cases take corrective measures like fading away, redirecting traffic, and so on. There are some cases, there are some companies, and there are some scale of some companies where this is absolutely fine, right? We all know that the Googles and Amazons of the world do this. They do it fine. So, sure, great. But it is extremely easy to become too clever. And that is the piece where I've seen where things like composability, understandability becomes so important. Because if you're not careful, you will lose control of your production environment. And I've seen two extremes of it, right? There is the extreme where too many things are happening and you lose control over it, to a point where there's always going to be a point, at least as of now, where you will never replace the human. There are, um, I have worked with some brilliant SREs that I know, at least in my working lifetime, are not going to be replaced. They have an almost intuitive understanding of where problems and risks can lie, right? So, from my perspective, whether it is around, understanding where risks can lie, looking at a design and saying that, that particular layer is going to be a problem, you need to put something around it, or you need to revisit it. That's not something that, as of now, AI can do. AI and ML and automation around that can do things like detecting anomalies, detecting deviations from trend, doing very basic things like that, and those are absolutely important, and that's fine. But yeah, there are certain things that they cannot do. The other side of it that I have seen a lot of startups that are trying to promote intelligent observability, intelligent DevOps,
Mm.
intelligent operations. And full credit to all of them, right? I have nothing against that at all. I could use some of those tools myself, but I'm yet to see situations where those are something beyond choice,
Okay.
right? Um, my concern is not so much around the concept, but around the specific application. Because again, in extremely large complex environments, your training data is going to be impacted a lot by things like traffic volume and your traffic pattern, your usage pattern, your user behavior, and your business imperatives, right? So unless you're able to give your models the right amount of training data and the right objective functions, I fail to see how you're going to get outcomes that are actually aligned with what you want to do. So again, I'm not saying that it's possible, and there are people smarter than me who are doing this. So I know that that's going to happen, but at least as of now, I don't see a world where the human is that easily replaceable. I do see a world though where these become tools that SREs use on their daily basis to identify issues, right? And we are doing that. We have been doing that for a while now.
Okay, there's so much debate of volume of alerts which are being generated by monitoring tools. Uh, And there have been talk about alert fatigue also. Do you see that as a problem, or have you not seen that problem, or how do you deal with that if you have seen it?
Yeah, I feel like I feel like almost anyone who tells you that alert fatigue and alert noise is not a problem is either lying to you
Or
or
maybe
lying
they
to
have not
themselves.
configured their monitoring correctly.
Right, right. How do you know the optimal level of false positives and so on? From my perspective, I treat that partly as, like you said, a configuration problem, right? You need to have adequate monitoring across your environment, but tuning alert thresholds is absolutely an art. I'm sure AI and ML can help with that, but again, there are some engineers who are just masters of this. And by the way, data here is important, right? So to me, there is a configuration aspect of it, but to me, I like to look at the problem from the other side, right? Um, the real effect or the real impact that this has is on the health of your on call, right? So, how much time is an on call person spending on dealing with spurious alerts or dealing with duplicated alerts? And to me, that is it's in many cases it's an operational health problem. So when you look at it that way, your goal isn't necessarily to do away with and optimize this extremely difficult optimization problem, but rather to take it to a manageable level where your teams can start building muscle memory and building runbooks around, what do you do? At some point, engineers on the ground, usually when you talk to your engineers on the ground, they will be able to tell you that I know almost intuitively that when I get an alert from X and Y source with X and Y information, X and Y payloads, I know that I can ignore it because that is just an artifact
Mhm.
of traffic or whatever, or there are other alerts or other conditions that will catch, the real problem. That's the kind of place where you need to go in and optimize, and maybe you ask yourself why does this exist, right? Um, from my perspective, the best way to do it, in fact, the only way to do it, I believe, is to leave it to those on-call engineers. So we, in all the companies I've worked at, I have found that having a clear program or understanding around on-call health and operational health and building the right kind of uh, empowerment for your on-the-ground engineers to actually tune those alert thresholds, to create new alerts, and to tune those thresholds across your engineering org. To me, that's the best way to scale out. If you're doing this within just your SRE org, you're probably setting yourself up for failure beyond, maybe a V1 kind of setup. So the way we do this is we build it into our production industries. We provide some basic training and some basic understanding that, hey, here are some alerts you basically get for free. And then beyond that, we rely and we encourage engineers to tune them, again, with the help of some of those anomaly detection data analytics tools that can help for us.
Okay. Do you have any advice for the SREs, new SREs, on how to do a work-life balance? Means you are a veteran in SRE, right? So do you have any advice for them, the young ones?
Personally, I actually think that the advice I have there is for SRE leadership and for company leadership. Because for the folks on the ground, on one hand, I'll always tell SRE ICs, the rank and file, that they need to surface the problem as soon as possible, right? If they believe that their work-life balance is out of whack, it is something that they need to be very cognizant of and they need to report that out, right? This is not a sprint. It's very easy when you're an SRE organization, it's very easy to fall into this heroism mode where by heroic activities every week or every month, you're keeping things up and running. To me, that is an opportunity. Sure, reward the people who are being heroic on the ground. To me, that is an opportunity to really rethink your leadership, right? So to me, I point the finger at leaders there. It is up to the leaders to take that data that they're getting from the rank and file and build the right level of expectation, the right level of understanding across the company, right? Getting buy-in from the rest of your execs and everyone else around funding SRE properly, ensuring that SRE has the right charter given your funding is absolutely critical to this. If your leadership is not doing that, it doesn't matter how great your ICs are. You are doing the ICs, you're doing the rank and file SREs a disservice. So I would generally point the finger upward. It is. I will also say that SRE life can be extremely stressful, right? When you have, we talked about this earlier, when you have a system where you lose $100 a second or $100,000 every 15 minutes or $1 million every 3 hours, you have to, there is no choice. You have to build on-call expectations that, you have to respond within 5 or 10 minutes. Otherwise, that page is getting escalated, right? So that is fine. So when that happens, that is fine. It is an expectation that is known and it is communicated upfront. So SREs generally know what they're signing up for. Ideally, all engineers who are on call should know what they're signing up for. But to make that consistent, to make that sustainable, and to ensure that that is not the life week in and week out for SREs, that is up to your leadership. Finally, I will say that it is extremely easy to get into this world where you are reactive as an SRE team, reacting to alerts. If the main thing that you're doing is reacting to alerts and solving problems, you have to ask yourself whether you're really an SRE team or whether you are an operations team. And it's completely okay to find yourself in an operational mode. But ideally, I have found that the best SRE organizations, their leaders have a path that charts them out of that world into a world where they are engineers, right? We are engineers first. Our job should be to preempt issues. It shouldn't be to respond to them. A very good example here is when it comes to incidents. I believe you and I had chatted about this earlier. As your first level of maturity, when you're building an incident management program, the first thing you're thinking of is, sure, run books and roles and responsibilities. How do you respond to incidents, detect them quickly, mitigate the problem, communicate the impact, and so forth, all of that. Great, that's extremely important. It's not negotiable, right? How do you have all that, all those metrics around those incidents, MTTR, all of that? Great. Build that, but that's only level one, right? Level two is where you realize that that is not the bottleneck for your company. The real value that you get from your incidents is what do you learn from it? And how do you learn about entire classes of problems for incidents, right? So you have a small incident, but it tells you that, hey, there is a massive amount of risk you're carrying in 2 or 3 unrelated areas, and how do you fix those problems going forward? That's, to me, the second level, right? And finally, there's a level beyond that, right? How do you get the same kind of learnings without having to suffer an incident before it, right? That is that proactive world where you are learning various other sources, but you're not having to suffer an incident to learn all these things. That is the next level. But to me, that journey and articulating the journey, that's the job of your leadership. And if you do, as leadership, if you do a good job of articulating that, SREs will follow you to the ends of the earth, right? And if you don't, then you are kind of doing them a disservice.
Okay, now since we're coming into this, before we end this, do you have any war room stories that you can share with our audience?
Sure. I will try to pick a story that is more of a business-related story. Probably good for folks who are thinking of companies that are thinking of going public. So this, before Pinterest went public, one of the first things that going public is a very big thing for a company. There are tons of activities that happen around it. Most of them don't happen within engineering, but for companies like Pinterest, but also most tech companies, your product suite is an extremely important focus area because building the right level of controls and compliance and so forth around it is extremely important. So there is a huge amount of technical work that needs to happen to get your systems ready for compliance. But that's not what this story is about. This story is about the specific period when you actually tell the world of your intention to go public. So the first thing that happens there is a form that you file with the regulators. In the US, it's called an S1. That's basically the first time the world hears that, okay, this company is planning to go public immediately within a few months. And that filing is a pretty important event. So, because when that happens, there's usually press around it. There's usually, it attracts traffic. It attracts specific types of traffic. It attracts malicious traffic. It attracts bad actors as well. to your system. So the timing of that is extremely important. It is known only to a very controlled group of people. All sorts of controls around it. And I remember being tasked with, making that specific time, that very specific moment in time, making that as safe as possible. Now, we had obviously built all sorts of controls, but that particular moment in time, we needed to do certain things to make sure that that was safe. So I set up a meeting with one of my SRE managers at that time, and basically set up a 1 hour meeting. And I remember him being very puzzled about the purpose of the meeting, because I asked him, we brought in a few other people, and I asked him to brainstorm with me all the things that could go wrong if something were to happen, and things where we know that, bodies might be buried in terms of risk and we need to do something. And I remember us building all sorts of extremely complicated charts and so forth, about things that we would need to do in the event of a very large sort of event, like a large PR event. And it was funny because throughout that time, I was basically keeping an eye on my phone while talking to them. And they got really into it. They built out this beautiful kind of diagram. And about 45 minutes into the call, I got the notification. And basically, I had to tell them, great, thanks for telling me all that. We literally have to do all of that in the next, hour, because it's happening. Something very important is happening. So, cancel all your meetings and make this happen. So basically, that's what happened. It was a early morning Pacific time, and we brought in about a whole bunch of folks. And essentially, in 45 minutes, we did a whole bunch of things that controlled the platform. The fact that nothing happened, it went on without risk, without hitches.
It's good to know when everything works the way it's expected.
Right, it's good to know when it all comes together. And honestly, there was things happened during that time, which I feel like it was judicious for us to have.
But it may have gone the other way around, right? If you would not have planned it.
I mean, that's true of anything, right? Anything can go wrong. But yes, being prepared is really a very important SRE value.
So thank you, Abhishek, for being here. But it's really great that you were able to actually spare that time for our audience. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity, and I hope at least some of this will be useful.
Yeah, I definitely think it will be. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Ankur, and have a great rest of your day.